Well, it's been a few months since we last did the class on confronting conversations between Samuel and Saul for the North Belford Sunday evening class. So just before we get into the confronting conversations between, for tonight, Jonathan and Saul, we just want to repeat some introductory comments. We often hear and we often say ourselves, do we not, brothers and sisters, how important communication is. We know, of course, that conversations are an integral part of building relationships. But we want to be very clear with these classes, with these titles of these classes, brothers and sisters, that a confronting conversation is not about being hostile or argumentative or aggressive. What it does mean is facing up and dealing with difficult matters. A confronting conversation cannot be driven by emotion. It will not go well. I think we've probably all experienced that. It's a conversation that can't be born out of anger. So it has to have the right motivations prompting it. And sometimes in life, brothers and sisters, certainly in ecclesial life, we are faced with what seems like impossible situations, where in our finite vision, we can see no way through the maze and the haze. We see so many obstacles and so many difficulties. And certainly Samuel, Jonathan, and David all had extremely difficult situations that they faced with Saul. And none of those men were above being in mortal danger from Saul, and yet he was their king. One provided by God based on the people's desire, and so was the anointed of Yahweh. So we want to talk about one of the only tools, really, that these faithful men had to try to encourage a change in Saul and thereby a change in their situations. Because, of course, retaliation is out of the question. Playing Saul's own game is wrong. Prayer and trust in our Heavenly Father is fundamental, particularly as they have these very difficult conversations with Saul. I'm sure we'd all agree that the faithful who had the most to do with Saul, at least that is on record for us, that God has left for us, is Samuel, Jonathan, and David. And we found it a very useful exercise to read through the record and to look at every conversation that any of these faithful men had with Saul. I think it's a very revealing way to look at it. What were their conversations with Saul like? What can we learn from them? What were their motives going into these conversations? And as someone who was as supremely self-focused as Saul was, he was a very challenging individual to have these conversations with. He was expert at shifting blame, of deflection away from himself, of justifying and making excuse, making himself look good and others bad. He was expert at gaining sympathy through portraying himself as the victim. So certainly a challenging individual to have a confronting conversation with. Now, there is on record for us, brothers and sisters, 3 conversations between Jonathan and his father Saul. So 3 conversations between father and son, of course, that is left, that God has chosen to leave on record for us. And that's not very many, is it? And 2 of them were confronting conversations initiated by Jonathan. Just like as we saw a few months ago Samuel initiated 2 confronting conversations with Samuel. And God willing, next week, when we look at confronting conversations between David and Saul, we'll see that David also initiates 2 confronting conversations with Saul. But for this evening, we're actually going to look at all 3 of the conversations that occurred between Jonathan and his father, Saul. Now, what Brother Dan read for us, and I recognize it was quite a lengthy chapter of 1 Samuel chapter 14, that, of course, contains the first conversation between father and son, a conversation in which Saul was prepared to kill his son. The second one, and we'll get to it later, obviously, is in chapter 19. And this is where Jonathan reconciles Saul to David. And then the third and final one that's on record for us is in 1 Samuel chapter 20, that we'll eventually get to. And that's when Saul exposes his true feelings about David to his son, Jonathan. But of course, we'll begin with the first one that is contained in tonight's reading of 1 Samuel chapter 14. I have a fondness for this chapter. I remember when I was 10 years old, my dad did an exhortation way back in the Elks Hall in Vernon. I don't know how many of you were ever there, but those of you who were, you'd be just a trip down memory lane, I guess. But my dad did the exhortation on 1 Samuel 14 when I was about 10 years old about Jonathan and his armor bearer and how they went up against this garrison of the Philistines, just 2 men climbing this cliff to go up against the whole garrison. And as a 10-year-old, it was one of those times where you just had no idea that this story was in the Bible. And I was totally fascinated by it. And I do think that this chapter is fascinating. It's also one that poses certain challenges, some of which we'd like to reflect on later in the class. But just as a lead-in to the first conversation on record for us between Jonathan and Saul, we want to follow a thread that goes through 1 Samuel chapter 14 to do with an aspect of Saul's reign that we can forget about, and it's easy for us to overlook. So just keep a finger or bookmark here in chapter 14 and just turn back a few pages, if you would, please, back to chapter 9. So 1 Samuel chapter 9, I just want to read verses 15 to 17. So this is actually at the anointing of Saul to be captain over God's people by Samuel the prophet. So beginning at verse 15, now Yahweh had told Samuel in his ear a day before Saul came, saying, tomorrow about this time I will send thee a man out of the land of Benjamin, and thou shalt anoint him to be captain over, and I want you to note the emphasis as we go through these 2 verses, over my people Israel, that he may save my people out of the hand of the Philistines, for I have looked upon my people, because their cry is come unto me. And when Samuel saw Saul, Yahweh said unto him, behold, the man whom I spake to thee of, this same shall reign over my people. So I think that's worth coloring in, because that's the divine emphasis. It's all about God's people, brothers and sisters. It's all about serving others. It's all about the ecclesia, and it's not about ourselves. And so here we see from these 3 verses that Saul is anointed to be a captain, and the primary job that God gave him was to save his people from the Philistines, because God heard their cry. And I think it's easy for us to forget and not to appreciate the mortal struggle with the Philistines that Israel experienced through the period of Samson as a judge that extended from that period all the way through the whole era of Samuel as a prophet, continued right through the whole rule of the first king of Israel. And that is what God wanted from Saul, to save my people Israel. I have looked upon my people. I have heard my people, says God. So everything in Saul's reign, and particularly fighting the Philistines, was to be for God's people. I think when we come to, the later life of Saul, in particular, as we turn now to 1 Samuel chapter 14, it's a very, very important principle, very important instruction that we need to keep in mind, because Saul most definitely lost sight of it. So the background to 1 Samuel 14, of course, is in chapter 13. Now, chapter 13, there was twice actually that Jonathan, on his own, without his father, went up against a garrison of the Philistines. And he's already done that in chapter 13 and verse 3, where we see that with 1/3 of the army, Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines. Now, what was Saul's response to that? We don't have time to look up all these verses, but in chapter 13, verses 3-4, what we see is that Saul blew the trumpet saying, "Let the Hebrews hear that Saul has smitten a garrison of the Philistines." So Jonathan was the one who acted in faith and went up against the Philistines, and he doesn't proclaim anything about it. Saul makes a proclamation. And what is the proclamation? Well, it is not that Jonathan was the one who led this victory. He's taking the accolades to himself. And the message that goes out to all the Hebrews is that Saul has smitten a garrison of the Philistines. And so then when we come to chapter 14, in verse 1, what is Jonathan doing versus what is Saul doing? In verse 1, we see that Jonathan says to his armor bearer, "Come, let us go up over to the Philistines' garrison." And 2 individuals are going to climb a cliff and seek God's blessing and have the courage and the faith to go against a whole garrison of Philistines, just the 2 of them together. And what is Saul doing? Well, we see in verse 2, where it says that Saul tarried under a pomegranate tree with 600 men. You see the huge contrast there. Saul has 600, 580 or 598 more individuals, and they have no courage, no faith. They're sitting under a pomegranate tree, despite the Philistines having gathered in battle array. Now, I'll look at Jonathan's spirit. You can see it in verse 12, where Jonathan said to his armor bearer, he says, "Come up after me, for Yahweh hath delivered them into the hand of Israel." Because Jonathan knows, brothers and sisters, that this is all about God's people. That is what God wanted from Saul. He wanted Saul to save his people, my people Israel, because I've looked upon my people and I've heard my people. And that's Jonathan's spirit. Yahweh hath delivered them into the hand of Israel. It wasn't about himself. It wasn't proclaiming anything about himself. It was about working for God and with God on the behalf of the ecclesia. Just compare that with verse 23 of chapter 14, where it says, "So Yahweh saved Israel that day, and the battle passed over unto Beth-aven. It was Jonathan and God working together, brothers and sisters. Yahweh saved Israel that day. God was at work. God was saving his people, and he was working through a faithful individual and his armor bearer. Now, you know what the very next verse says? Have a look at verse 24. And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had adjured the people, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged on mine enemies. So none of the people tasted any food. You see, brothers and sisters, Saul made this all about him. And in making it all about him, it was extremely detrimental to God's people. And so while Jonathan and God were working together on the behalf of the ecclesia, Saul was working against them. And it reminds us, and you'll see in your center margin, a number of cross references back to Joshua chapter 7, because there's a lot of connections back to Achan's sin when he took of the accursed thing. And in Joshua chapter 7, speaking to Achan, the troubler of Israel, Joshua said to him, Why have you troubled us? And here in this chapter 14, Jonathan says, My father hath troubled the land. And so in both cases, the nation, God's people, were troubled at a very time when God was at work, helping them, assisting them against their enemies. But because of the selfishness of certain individuals, that work of God is being confronted. So God's people were being troubled. How did Saul here in 1 Samuel chapter 14 trouble the land? Because Jonathan was very accurate when he said that. My father is troubling the land. So how is he? Well, there's a couple of ways in which Saul is troubling the land. First of all, he troubled the land in the unnecessary and harmful burden he put upon the people in not allowing them to eat. And that demand that he put on others was incredibly selfish. In verse 24 of this chapter, we read that the men of Israel were distressed that day. We read in verse 28 that the people were faint. That progresses by verse 31 to the people were very faint. And so we see that Saul is causing exhaustion when, as a leader, he should have nourished and provided. That's one way in which he troubled the land. Another way in which he troubled the land was that this day was the opportunity of a lifetime to break the stranglehold that the Philistines had on Israel. And Saul blew it. Now, if Saul had been God-focused instead of self-focused, everything would have turned out so different. And it's the same in our lives, brothers and sisters. This is not just about condemning Saul. This is about taking lessons from the life of Saul, from the life of Jonathan and David, and taking those lessons. What is so critical for us to learn, brothers and sisters, is that we need to be God-focused in all that we do and in all our motivations, and not be self-focused. Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 8 says, Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroyeth much good. I think sometimes we see that in ecclesial life, and we certainly see that here in the life of Saul. Verse 30 of chapter 14 says, Jonathan says, how much more, what he's in the context he's saying is, we could have defeated so many more Philistines. How much more if haply the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found? For had there not been now a much greater slaughter among the Philistines? Of course, this is not any like bloodlust on Jonathan's part, is it? In anointing Saul captain over his people, God had tasked him primarily with one thing: to save his people from the Philistines. And he is resisting that purpose of God. And that is where utterly selfish behavior can actually lead us, brothers and sisters, where we actually resist what God is trying to accomplish. So with that as some background, I just want to jump now to Jonathan and Saul's first conversation. So we turn over the page to verse 37. We're just going to read together verse 37 to 43. This is the first recorded conversation between this father and son. And it goes like this. Verse 37, and Saul asked counsel of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into the hand of Israel? But God answered him not that day. And Saul said, draw ye near hither all the chief of the people, and know and see wherein this sin hath been this day. For, as Yahweh liveth, which saveth Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. But there was not a man among all the people that answered him. Then said he unto all Israel, be ye on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side. And the people said unto Saul, do what seemeth good unto thee. Therefore Saul said unto Yahweh Elohim of Israel, give a perfect lot. And Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. And Saul said, cast lots between me and Jonathan my son. And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what thou hast done. And Jonathan told him and said, I did but taste a little honey with the end of the rod that was in mine hand, and lo, I must die. Again, it's almost as though Saul is trying to act like Joshua in this incident when Joshua was seeking for the cause of the defeat at Ai. And God told him that Israel had sinned and taken of the accursed thing. You remember on that occasion that Joshua brought all Israel before him, and when Achan was taken, Joshua said to him, tell me what thou hast done, hide it not from me. And here Saul has done a very similar process, and he says to his son, tell me what you have done. And we need to think about Jonathan's answer. We need to remember that he has had an astounding day. You know, many hours earlier, just that morning, he'd picked a fight with a whole garrison of Philistines with only his armor bearer. And although he did not presume upon God, he knew for a fact that God was with him as he had asked for a sign, and God had kept him safe from all those Philistine swords. He had delivered them into his hand, and God caused a trembling in the whole host of the Philistines, even causing an earthquake on that day, so that Israel had a much needed victory. And now, at the close of that same day, brothers and sisters, Jonathan stands singled out in front of the army. And he is found at fault for not hearing a rash vow that implicated him for doing something as natural and normal as partaking of some sustenance for energy. And when he was asked what he did, he simply accurately and honestly says exactly what he did. He ate a little honey that he dipped his rod in, and he simply says, "And lo, I must die." And this was a man, brothers and sisters, who was prepared to fight against incredible odds, but he wasn't about to fight for self. He could have lambasted his father for his foolish troubling of Israel that day. He could have defended all of his own actions. He could have called upon the people to come to his defense. But you see, brothers and sisters, while Saul is among the most selfish of all the biblical characters, Jonathan is among the most unselfish of all the biblical characters. And so we see the father at one extreme end of the spectrum and the son at the polar opposite end. And it's just one of the very many examples in Scripture, brothers and sisters, that show that we do not have to become a product of our environment. Well, Saul, again, using religion for his own ends under a pretense of holiness and vow keeping, he responds in verse 44. So this conversation is continuing. He responds in verse 44 with, "God, do so and more also, for thou shalt surely die, Jonathan." And so Jonathan would have died at the hands of his dad had not the people stepped in. But before we look at and consider verse 45, consider a couple other verses. Have a look at verse 36, where it says, "The people said to Saul, 'Do whatsoever seemeth good unto thee.'" Verse 40, very similarly, it says, "The people said to Saul, 'Do what seemeth good unto thee.'" Because you see, with an individual like Saul, brothers and sisters, it was easiest and it was safest to go along with whatever it was that Saul wanted to do. Because Saul was too proud to have a group of advisors or counselors to help make him beneficial, to help make beneficial decisions for the nation. He was an individual who made important decisions unilaterally for selfish means. And so now let's read verse 45, where it says, "And the people said unto Saul, 'Shall Jonathan die, who hath wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid. As Yahweh liveth, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he hath wrought with God this day.' So the people rescued Jonathan, that he died not." So you see, Saul has created this situation that absolutely backfires on him. Now just in your mind's eye, imagine that scene, brothers and sisters, as Saul and Jonathan were isolated by Lot, and then Jonathan is singled out and proclaimed worthy of death. And united as one, all the people who previously feared the consequences of the oath and who went along with Saul in whatever pleased him, they all now, as one, move to stand alongside of Jonathan. And so what began as an effort to vindicate self and to get rid of a much better man than he ends up with this extremely uncomfortable standoff, really. As Saul now realizes that his own actions have been called out as the people have seen through them. And the only thing he has accomplished was to utterly humiliate himself. And it really does have similarities to the fall of Haman. All that he endeavored to accomplish was turned on himself. And you think of Jonathan at that time, brothers and sisters, for him, well, he must have been filled with appreciation to the people and to his God. He must also have been filled with a sense of foreboding, knowing that his own dad was prepared to kill him. And you could imagine him being very unsure of what the future would hold. That, brothers and sisters, is the first recorded conversation between Jonathan and Saul, his father. Don't worry, we're not going to spend 45 minutes on the second one and the third one. So the next conversation recorded for us between Jonathan and Saul is one in which Jonathan is going to confront his father concerning his treatment of David. And we find that conversation in chapter 19 of 1 Samuel. So the conversation takes place in 1 Samuel chapter 19, verses 4 to 6. Now, first of all, just for the context, we'll look at verse 1, where it says, "And Saul spake to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David." There's a lot of different behaviors of Saul that degenerate, that get worse with time. And one of them is his desire to kill David. This was a desire that began by secret manipulation so that nobody would know his intentions. And it began with, he had this desire that the Philistines would kill him instead of his own hand. And that has degenerated now, as we have seen that verse we just read, to the point of openly commanding all of his servants and even his son Jonathan to kill his best friend David. Verses 2 and 3, Jonathan does the right thing in defending David. And he tells David that he will speak to his father about him and that consequently he would let David know what he learned, just, to see where Saul stands in all of this. And that is a conversation that would have taken a lot of courage. It would have taken mental preparation. It would have taken prayer and trust. And so he approaches his father in verses 4 and 5, where it says, "And Jonathan spake good of David unto Saul his father, and said unto him, Let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he hath not sinned against thee, and because his works have been to thee word very good. For he did put his life in his hand and slew the Philistine, and Yahweh wrought a great salvation for Israel. Thou sawest it and didst rejoice. Wherefore then wilt thou sin against innocent blood to slay David without a cause?" As you read that, you get a sense that this is an appeal, brothers and sisters, an appeal based on facts that avoids direct criticism. Just a few observations in how he approaches this conversation, brothers and sisters. Number one, he rightly speaks good of David in showing his innocence, but he also uses wisdom and tact when he is careful to remind Saul that David is but his servant. And he doesn't overly praise David because he knows that that would simply be a trigger for Saul. Number two, he reminds Saul that it was Yahweh who had wrought the victory when David slew the giants. Number three, just as Samuel reminded Saul of a better time, so here Jonathan does when he reminds Saul that there was a time when Saul rejoiced when David slew Goliath. Number 4, there is nothing about himself in this. Jonathan does not drag more unnecessary things into this conversation. And then finally, and yet there is no compromise on what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. He makes it clear when he twice says that Saul would be sinning if he lifted his hand against David. Verse 6 and 7, let's see what the response is from Saul. And Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul sware, as Yahweh liveth, he shall not be slain. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan showed him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. So it wasn't that Saul didn't have a conscience. I just want to share some insight from the writings of Brother Islip Collier. This is from a series that he wrote in the Christadelphian magazine. The series was on human nature in ancient Israel, and then he had a particular article strictly on Saul. And this is what Brother Islip Collier wrote concerning Saul. Perhaps more than any other character in the Bible, Saul illustrates the truth that evil passions poison the soul. Anger, jealousy, hatred, and pride were all extremely developed in him. Yet he retained sufficient of conscience to make him miserable, enough capacity for love to give the finishing touch of tragedy to his hatred. Saul loved David and was more than once smitten with remorse when for a moment he came to realize how deeply he had wronged him. Yet jealousy of David drove him to the point of murder. He recognized God and showed some respect for divine laws, yet he could not humble himself beneath the hand of God. There are hundreds of men and women who cannot forget, cannot forgive, cannot humble themselves even before God. There are many still who nurse grievances and cultivate evil feelings until they turn their souls into poison factories. They make mistakes, and instead of getting rid of them by humble confession and honest effort to reform, they turn them into permanent diseases. They are disgusted with themselves, but they convert the feeling of disgust into an aggravation of their distemper. They become rebels on a large or small scale according to temperament and opportunity, leading most miserable lives and putting a blight on those with whom they come into contact. Perhaps we may go further and say that all of us, or nearly all of us, in some measure and at some time in our lives, follow the bad example of Saul. We have made a mistake and we feel disgusted with ourselves. Instead of clearing away the evil by humility and repentance, we turn our folly into a grievance and nurse it. I think those are very wise, very insightful, very powerful words for all of us to consider and to ponder and to take to our own hearts. Verse 7, we just read that Jonathan calls David. Jonathan brings David back to Saul so that David is in Saul's presence once again. And I think that Jonathan must have been very thankful at that time for the restoration of his father and his friend. But here's the thing, brothers and sisters. Regardless of his oath before Yahweh that David would not be killed, within 3 verses, Saul is again trying to pin David to the wall. And you see that in verse 10. within 3 verses, is attempting to kill David again. And in fact, the whole rest of this chapter speaks of ways in which Saul would attempt to kill David without a care in the world of other people. This is a man who is prepared to kill his daughter's husband in their bed right in front of her. He was prepared to go to Samuel's home and take David in front of the old prophet. So there was no real change in Saul at all, was there? But there was, I believe, a small change, and that is that from now on, Saul is going to hide from Jonathan his real intentions and behavior regarding David. And so that brings us to the third conversation, just one more recorded conversation between Jonathan and Saul, and it is a confronting one. It wasn't necessarily intended to be. I think here that Jonathan was testing the waters, as it were. But as rehearsed as Jonathan was for this conversation, and whatever direction he would take, have you ever had that before? You know that you're going to have a difficult conversation with someone, and you try to play through all the potential avenues that conversation might go. And there are times in the end where it went in a direction that you're absolutely flabbergasted. You just had no idea, despite hours of trying to think things through. It went totally down a different path than you would ever have expected. I think that's what happened with Jonathan. Because in this next conversation, he was unsuspecting and he was unprepared for the way it turned out. And sometimes our conversations are like that. Now, there's a bit of a backstory to that conversation that we just want to consider first. Now, if you just turn over a page, this final conversation recorded for us between father and son is in 1 Samuel chapter 20. And 1 Samuel 20 begins with David pretty shaken. You know, within hours, he has dodged Saul's spear. He's escaped his own home through a window. He fled to the one place in Israel that he felt he could potentially be safe with the old prophet Samuel, only to have Saul follow him there. And then what does he do? What can he do? He makes his way back to where Jonathan is, and the two friends have, in the beginning of chapter 20, a substantial disagreement. And you see that in chapter 20, verses 1 and 2, where it says, "And David fled from Naioth and Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, 'What have I done? What is mine iniquity and what is my sin before thy father that he seeketh my life?' And Jonathan said to him, 'God forbid, thou shalt not die. Behold, my father will do nothing either great or small, but that he will show it me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so.' Rotherham says, there is nothing in this. Yeah? Nothing in this. Now, put yourself in David's shoes, brothers and sisters. Of course, David very well knows that his life is in danger. He's experienced time and time and time again where Saul's efforts to kill him were extremely real. And now his best friend is telling him, it's nothing. Don't worry about it, David. My dad will tell me if he plans to do anything against you. It's nothing. It can't be true. Even though Jonathan himself knew firsthand what Saul could be like, he didn't believe David. He didn't appreciate the position that David was in. Brothers and sisters, that lack of understanding put David in greater danger. And there are situations where giving giving the benefit of the doubt can not only be detrimental, but is harmful. I think that this is a very good example, brothers and sisters, of the Lord's words, where he says that we need to be wise as serpents, along with being as innocent of doves. You know, the context of when the Lord said that was when he sent out the disciples as sheep among wolves. You know, Jacob's prophecy in Genesis 49 was that Benjamin was a ravenous wolf. And as a Benjamite, Saul lived up to that. And Jonathan should have been more circumspect. And certainly we don't lose sight of the fact that, of course, the greater fault is with Saul and not Jonathan, especially as Saul behaved differently around Jonathan. But we also need to remember, brothers and sisters, that those tactics that Saul uses of minimizing and deflection and directing blame elsewhere can be, and were, in this case, extremely effective. Just put a bookmark here and just turn back to the reading where we've already been of 1 Samuel chapter 14. I just want to share an example with you where myself personally, I have listened to Saul instead of the facts. And maybe you have as well. We said earlier that this chapter does pose certain challenges in 1 Samuel chapter 14, and verses 37 to 42 is one of them. We've already read these verses. So just to remind ourselves, verse 37, we see that Saul is asking counsel of God. And what does the end of verse 37 say? God answered him not that day. That's the divine narrative, brothers and sisters. That's the facts concerning the events of that day. God did not answer Saul that day. So, was God in the lot? If the divine record says that God did not answer Saul that day, God was not in that lot that Samuel proceeded to perform in front of the whole nation, which ultimately accused Jonathan of being worthy of death. And I think, you know, if we didn't realize that, if we didn't take to heart the end of verse 37, there are some very burning questions in this chapter, such as, why does God select Jonathan in the lot? What would our answer be to that? Why is Jonathan worthy of death? And it's confusing, isn't it? Like, how can Jonathan be worthy of death when he has wrought with God that day? It's very clear, it's obvious that God has been with him and has worked alongside of him through the whole day, and his only sin is not hearing a rash vow of his father, and he eats a little bit of honey. Is that worthy of death before God's eyes? Working alongside of God that whole day. It doesn't sound right, does it? It makes you shake your head. And it didn't click with me until Brother Zip Collier spelt it out in an article that he wrote in 1952. He actually wrote quite a few. I think he was intrigued with the character of Saul. He wrote quite a few articles on him. But this is how he wrote. He wrote, it seems amazing that some modern readers have allowed Saul to interpret matters for them. That's me. I always thought that God was in that lot because I listened to Saul instead of the facts contained in this chapter. It seems amazing that some modern readers have allowed Saul to interpret matters for themselves. They have supposed, as the faulty king assumed, that when God gave them no answer that evening, it was because Jonathan, the faithful hero of the day, not having heard his father's foolish curse, had taken a little honey and had been refreshed by it. And they have supposed that although God gave no answer either through ark or ephod, he was sure to answer through the lot. We have been invited to note how unerringly the lot pointed to Jonathan. We should have thought it was a very erring chance to condemn as guilty the one righteous and faithful man in the army. The narrative does not give the slightest justification for Saul's egoistical assumption. God gave no answer either through the ark or the ephod, and we may be sure that he did not heed Saul's demand, give a perfect lot. If God had influenced the lot, he may have allowed the first choice to stand as it chanced to fall, letting the misguided people escape. The second lot would assuredly have taken Saul, the proud and rebellious king, while letting his righteous son escape. But God answered not that night, even through the ephod. Saul revealed his growing folly by his readiness to slay Jonathan on the assumption that nothing was of any importance but his own foolish curse. He apparently could not perceive even the possibility that his own sin or the sin of the people provoked by his folly could be the reason for God refusing to answer. The faulty people were nearer to understanding. They at least recognized that God, working through faithful Jonathan, had saved them. And there's a part of that that's scary, brothers and sisters. Because Saul controlled this situation to his advantage and to the severe detriment of others. And as I said, I know for myself that to a degree, I let Saul write the narrative of chapter 14 for me. And it led only to confusion and a deflection of the facts. And so certainly when I say that Jonathan should have been more circumspect, I say it to myself as well. Back in 1 Samuel 20, we'll wrap this up. I know we're over time now. In 1 Samuel 20, we know the story, how that Jonathan and David, they come up with a plan to determine whether Saul was hostile to David or not. And this plan is really for Jonathan's benefit, isn't it? David already knew the answer, and you can see how he anticipates Saul's reaction. Like, a number of times in his conversation with Jonathan, he's like, what if your father answers thee roughly? A lot of those kind of things, like he knows exactly what's going to happen. He's experienced Saul enough to know. We come to the conversation itself in verse 27. It came to pass on the morrow, which was the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said unto Jonathan his son, so here's the conversation, wherefore cometh not the son of Jesse to meet, neither yesterday nor today? And Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said, let me go, I pray thee, for our family hath a sacrifice in the city, and my brother, he hath commanded me to be there. And now, if I have found favor in thine eyes, let me get away, I pray thee, and see my brethren. Therefore he cometh not unto the king's table. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, thou son of the perverse, rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father and said unto him, wherefore shall he be slain? What hath he done? And Saul cast a javelin at him to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and did eat no meat the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David, because his father had done him shame. Verse 30. The treasury of scriptural knowledge has this comment alongside of verse 30, where it says, this reflection on the mother of Jonathan by the passionate monarch reflects more dishonor on himself than on his brave and noble-minded son. King Saul, unable to vilify Jonathan to his own satisfaction by personal reproaches, outstepped the ordinary abuse of his day and proceeded to that which was designed to produce unusual vexation, invented the bitterness of his mind by maligning the character of his own wife and Jonathan's mother. There were no bounds, brothers and sisters, to who Saul vilified. And in the interest of time, we just want to take one observation from Jonathan's example out of this conversation. There were two men who were angry at this table, wasn't there? There was Saul, who was filled with selfish anger and acted on it in an attempt to murder his own flesh and blood. Jonathan also, we just read, was filled with fierce anger. And he did the best thing he could have done, and he arose from the table and left. But verse 34 that we just read, brothers and sisters, tells us why he was angry. It says that he was grieved for David because his father had done him shame. And brothers and sisters, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, it is so easy to be angry when we are attacked, when we are called into question, when we are wronged. But Jonathan's anger here was on the behalf of someone else, because he was one of the most unselfish of all the biblical characters and sisters. And he portrays to us an example that we should strive to follow, as each of us strive day by day to learn to be God-focused and not self-focused.